All right, welcome everyone to Teaching the Constitution through Student Collaboration. We're going to get started in just a moment here. Make sure we can get these remaining participants in the waiting room connected. But we're so excited that you're joining us for our session. I'm Katie Munn. I'm the National Civic Education Coordinator at the National Archives, and I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
I'm Charlie Flanagan, and I do educational outreach for the Center for Legislative Archives. I work for the coolest part of the National Archives because we have the records of Congress, which are, I think, the most interesting. So if you'd like to say hi in the chat box and tell us who you are and what you teach, that would just make it more fun. So go ahead and take a second and just say hello and where you teach. We'd like to know what grades you teach.
Absolutely. And then we'll start diving right into some fantastic resources we have for you all today on teaching the Constitution. So feel free to use that chat to say hello, but I'll go ahead and start with our introduction of the National Archives. So Charlie and I are connecting with you both from the Washington, D.C. area, but the National Archives is truly a national organization. We have locations, we have over 40 locations across the country, including the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum in Michigan. And across these locations, we have over 16 billion records because the National Archives preserves and protects the historically valuable records of the United States government and makes them available to the public. So this makes for about 2 to 3% of the records actually created by the federal government end up at the National Archives. And you can see from this slide, our records range from textual records to maps, charts, and drawings, to photographs, to electronic records, to reels of film. So there are so many rich resources and rich primary sources in our holdings that you can use to teach civics and history. Now, navigating these vast holdings sometimes can be challenging. So today, Charlie and I are going to share some resources, some primary sources that you can use when teaching about the Constitution, one of our most famous documents at the National Archives. In fact, here's a picture of our building in Washington, D.C. And this next photo is, of course, the rotunda of the National Archives. And y'all, if you wouldn't mind in the chat just dropping in, what's the first word you think of when you see this space? How would you describe it if you were walking into this room? And hello to everyone in the chat. So excited to see we've got some middle school, high school teachers joining us today. We're going to have resources for all of you in our presentation. Some of the words I think of are definitely grand. It's very formal. The majestic, thanks Frank, that's a great descriptor, very rich. We can find a lot of American symbolism throughout this space. The architecture suggests that this is an important room with important things in it. And in fact, this is where we can find the Constitution of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights. So when we walk into the space, we get a sense that these documents are important. But as we approach the Constitution, and let's take a closer look at the 4 pages here, what words come to mind as you're looking at the Constitution as an artifact? How would you describe it? What do you notice about it? Looking at this original version. So we've got, it's definitely small, so it can be difficult to read, absolutely, between the cursive, between the fading in some places. We understand from the architecture, the way it's presented, this is an important document. We know the Constitution's important, but when you actually approach these 4 pages, it can be challenging to get into. And once you do get into the language, we find a lot of formal language, a lot of jargon. So today we are going to highlight resources from the National Archives that you can use to help make this document accessible and approachable with your students and help them unlock the big ideas that we can find in these 4 pages that set up our system of government, that encourage ways for students to work together, talk to each other, and then share what they found with you. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlie now to introduce our first resource.
Thank you, Katie. Katie is too modest to say this about her own biography, but one of her distinctions is actually she's a Michigan native. And so it's an honor to share the stage with her tonight. She's also a graduate of the University of Michigan. So she's a true Michigander. And so anyway, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you. We talk with teachers around the country about teaching the Constitution. And one of the paradoxes is that teachers are passionate about teaching it, but they're often assigned to teach it to middle school kids. And when you do that, you've got a classroom in which the kids represent a wide range of reading abilities, a wide range of cultural backgrounds, and really a wide range of educational readinesses. And so how can you make the Constitution accessible to students? We feel that the best education comes out of an active process in which students engage with the primary source, but also engage with their peers, and they ask questions and they make hypotheses and they kind of make sense of things. They construct a new understanding of American civic life from studying the Constitution. So we made this lesson. We were told from civics teachers that teaching the Constitution was very hard with middle school kids. And so we said, okay, what can we do to make it kid friendly? So we made a lesson which has a variety of activities, and it gets at 6 big concepts that most state standards want students to know about from the Constitution: limited government, republicanism, checks and balances, federalism, separation of powers, and popular sovereignty. Well, the problem is the founders didn't give us a glossary, and those words are not used in the document. So you have to create a situation where kids can discover these terms, can interpret these terms from other usages and other phrasing in the document. So the first step is you have to make that document accessible. So the next slide, please, Katie. So this is the lesson that we created to make that accessibility happen, called Teaching 6 Big Ideas in the Constitution. And the first activity of this lesson is the most popular contribution I've ever made to American education. Lots and lots of teachers have found this useful, and I hope you will too, because the first activity is to have the kids make a map of the Constitution. They're going to see the design by making a simple map of it. They're going to work in collaborative groups. And you make 7 groups, and each group calculates the comparative size of one of the Constitution's 7 articles. Then the 7 groups contribute their findings to a 100-cell table, illustrating the sequence and size of the various ideas. And so I'll show you how to do that. Before we go any further, Katie, if you would back up for one slide, just one slide for 1 second. If you would like to get this lesson after we talk about it tonight, on the screen right now is the direct address for it. You don't have to remember the whole thing. Just remember the title, Teaching 6 Big Ideas in the Constitution. But you see, if you go to archives.gov/legislative/resources, you will see links that lead you into the lesson plans that we have there. And listed among those lesson plans, you'll see Teaching 6 Big Ideas in the Constitution. So suppose you're sitting here and you go, wow, I want to teach with that tomorrow. That's where you find it. Okay.
Yeah, and Charlie, I'll actually chime in here. We put together a PDF of all of the resources from today's presentation. I'm going to drop an email into the chat. And in fact, if you just email that email address after today's presentation, I'll send you all of the links of resources from today's program, just to make finding everything a little bit easier for you today.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. If we could then go back to 2 slides ahead. Okay. So we have handouts, and in our lessons, we do a lot of PDF handouts because, you know, we want you to be able to organize the students' learning. And in this one, this handout shows the process, that how it starts, because you've made 7 groups, and each group has one of the articles of the Constitution, and you save the preamble for yourself so you can model what you're going to do. If you were to open up a transcript of the Constitution on your computer screen and you highlighted the whole document, you would find there are 4,379 words in the Constitution. And if you look at the table on the screen, you'll see at the head of the 3rd column that number, 4,379. Were you to highlight just the preamble, you see there are 52 words. Article 1 has about 2,500 words, and so on. All the articles are different. And you could readily find out how big they are. And so first, we want the students to figure out how big the different elements of the Constitution are compared to one another. Okay, if we could kindly go to the next slide. So here you can see how the Constitution is made up of pieces that are all different. You can see the number of words in the second column, the preamble having 52, Article 1 having 2,200, Article 2, 1,000, and so on down the list. So in each group, the first task the students have is to calculate how big is their article. And again, they use a transcript, and by just highlighting, they can figure it out. We also supply, you don't have to tell the kids this, but we supply an answer key so that you don't have to do the math on the fly. Okay, so then once they have determined how many words there are in their article, then you get to do an interdisciplinary activity. You get to bring math into your civics classroom or your history classroom, because the students are going to divide the number of words in their article by the number of words in the entire document. And that will yield the fraction of the whole Constitution that their article manifests. So when you divide, I'll show you with the preamble example. If you'd go one more slide, please, Katie. So if you take the words and you divide them by the total number of words in the Constitution, that will give you the percentage that your article represents. Then you're going to calculate how many cells of a 100 cell table your article would fill. How much of the Constitution is Article 1? How much of it is Article 2? And people always ask, so you round up if you get a decimal, and you fill in each article using a distinct color. So each group has had one article, they take ownership of it, they figure out how big it is, then they use a distinct color to fill in a chart. And if you do it in sequence, you're going to build the Constitution, and Article 1 will come before Article 2, and it just makes it so much easier. Okay, please go to the next slide. Here's what they're going to map on. So if we have figured out the size of various articles, we'll then take our distinct color, and you see that each of these rectangles is 1%. So if something were 50%, you'd fill in 50 rectangles. If it were 75%, you'd fill in 75 rectangles, and so on. Ideally, you come out with your Constitution filling 100 rectangles for the whole thing. But again, with rounding, sometimes I've come out at 99, and some groups have come out at 101. I tell them, we don't sweat the little stuff like that. The big thing is what ideas can we discern from this map that we've made. But you get them in order from the preamble down through Article 7, and you'll have a very colorful display, and I'll show you one in just a minute. Okay, if we could advance, please. Here's that preamble slide. So we know that if we highlight the preamble, we'll have 52 words. So we would take our 52 words and we would divide them by 4,379. And I just have one thing to say. Thank God for the cell phone, because you just take out your cell phone and you do the math, and you would get this decimal 0.0118. Well, if you want to change that to a percentage, as you know, you just move the decimal point 2 places to the right. So in other words, the preamble is 1% of the Constitution. And that same math operation would yield you the percentage for the other articles as well. Okay, next slide, please. So there's what you do. You had the preamble, and you got it from your math operation to say, okay, it's 1% of the Constitution. So you model for the students, you color in the preamble, and the next group that's going to put their total in is going to be Article 1, and they would use a different color. After them, Article 2, and they would use a third color, and so on down the line. And so what you're going to do is construct a map. Okay, Katie, next slide, please. So here's what you have. This is the data that you would end up with. So you can see that the about half the Constitution is Article 1, and then Article 2 is about a quarter of it. But then the other articles are quite small. And so if we could kindly go to the next slide, that's what you get. You get a map that shows you the different articles of the Constitution. And so, okay, why are we doing this? Well, let's just remind ourselves. We got into this activity because students find the Constitution hard to read. They find the words hard to decode. They find the ideas abstract. There's just a lot of things in there that are very hard for a kid to understand. I've never met a 7th grader yet who could tell me what domestic tranquility is. And so they get hung up on things like that. What this does is it backs up the camera and you say, okay, instead of getting bogged down in 18th century words, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the landscape of ideas. Okay, so that's the result of our map. Next slide, please. So having done that, they're going to refer to a transcript of the Constitution to see what their article is about. Remember, we assigned each group to take ownership of one of the articles. So they're going to go back and figure out, what is Article 1 about? What is Article 2 about? And they're going to figure out what their article contributes to the overall design for government presented in the Constitution. Well, the kids would call this a cheat code, but I'll tell you, the way the Constitution is written is very deductive. The main idea of each article is contained in the first sentence. And so if they carefully read the first sentence of their article, they can get the big idea, and you can coach them to do that. So, legislative power shall reside in a House of Representatives and a Senate. Oh, okay. This article must be about Congress. And so you go through and you've taken ownership and you figured out what your article's about. Okay, next slide, please. So then you fill in on the handout that we had, the worksheet. Okay, I had Article 1. Article 1 was this big. It was such and such percentage, and it was about Congress. Article 2 was this 1,000 words big. It was this percentage of the Constitution, and it was, about the executive branch, and so on. And so each group has delineated what their article is about. And as a class, you've made a map, and you've made this kind of scale to the map. Okay, next slide, please. Now, here's what you get. You've got the map, and you've got your key to the map. So the preamble is about forming a more perfect union. You know that Article 1 is about Congress. Article 2 is about the executive. Article 3 is about the courts. Article 4 about citizen and state rights. Article 5 about amending. Article 6 about how the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And Article 7 is about ratification. It takes about 15 minutes for a class to do this. And that short period of time yields a model that you can unpack about 100 different ways. And I'll just show you a couple. I've had teachers who've put this up on the classroom wall and kept it there so that later in the year they can refer back to it, and the kids literally stay oriented to how the Constitution was designed. Could we kindly go to the next slide? Thank you. So look at all the questions you can answer. So you have students look at political cartoons in your class, and you say to them, in what article of the Constitution would we look to find details about the powers of Congress? Or suppose we're looking at an editorial or a newspaper story, and it's about Congress, and they're talking about the constitutional power of Congress, something like the filibuster. In what part of the Constitution would we look to find this power of Congress described? And so having made the map, we say, oh, it must be Article 1, because Article 1 is about Congress. If there's a question about the courts, where do we look? We look in Article 3 and so on. Okay, next slide, please. Where would we look to find the process for amending the Constitution? It's an election year, and candidates will be running for office. And a lot of them often say, if I am elected, I will propose an amendment to do some aspirational thing. And so as a voter, you want to be able to sort out, how likely is it that this person can actually pull this off, that this amendment will become a thing? Well, take them to Article 5. If they know where it is and they know what it says, then they can realize that, well, you can propose a constitutional amendment quite easily. Getting it ratified is a whole nother issue. It's much harder. So it helps them put things in perspective, and it helps them understand perhaps if they know more about Article 5, why our Constitution has lasted so long, because it has it's difficult, but it's changeable. You can do it. You can't do it readily, but you can do it. Next slide, please. And so, now we're getting into less kind of factual questions and maybe more a little bit interpretive questions. And we ask the question, which branch received the most attention in the Constitution? And there's a lot of different ways you can slice this question, but I'm going to let you use the chat box and tell me which branch received the most attention in the Constitution. And of course, you have to think about the word attention. Congress, we hear. Okay, Article 1. Now, the way you can have a debate about this and have an open-ended conversation about this is by asking, did the founders want Congress to be powerful, and so they devoted a lot of the Constitution to it? Or did the founders fear that Congress would become too powerful, and so they devoted a lot of words to reining it in? And of course, you can answer that question either way. The important things with the students is to get them to not say, yeah, whatever. You want to punctuate their apathy with some kind of a question that they have to wrestle with. And so, yeah, we have the legislative powers got almost half the attention. Okay, next slide, please. And so, if you're looking historically, if you're teaching a history class, you can say, what does this map reflect about political questions from the Revolutionary era? And, they want to have government by the people. Where's the people's branch? Perhaps it's in Congress. Why do you think, coming out of the Revolutionary War, they might have made Article 2 come second and be only half as big as Article 1? Does anybody have a theory about what they might have felt about executive power in the 1780s? And I asked you an essay question, and I'm not going to give you time to answer an essay question. But if anybody has a haiku that answers that, you'd have time to put that in the chat box. But you get the idea that you could get kids to think about. Let me just show you a couple other questions, kind of things you could do. Next slide, please. To what extent does this map match today's federal government? Again, inevitably, a student will hear somebody say, we ought to go back to the Constitution the way it was written. And they don't have a frame of reference to know how to hear that statement. Now, if you look at this map, to what extent does this map represent the federal government as we know it today? Is Congress really that much of the landscape of power in Washington? Does the president really play second fiddle to Congress? And of course, we're barred by the Hatch Act from actually taking up that question ourselves. We'll just leave that one out there as a rhetorical question. But the question of, how does the Constitution function? Is it an explicit design for government, or is it a general statement of principles about government? That distinction has been argued from day one. And it's really important that the students understand that there are good theories on both sides, and listening to what people say who don't agree with you is incredibly important in our civic life. So these open-ended questions are chances to build that kind of civil and civic dialogue about the Constitution. Okay, next slide, please. So how would you have to divide this pie if you wanted to make a diagram of the Constitution as it was written? So you made your map. Would you have to change this? Did the founders design a government in which each branch was about the same heft as the others? And we're just looking at the words on the page, and we're looking at the order in which it was written. But what we're doing, we're students in your class, and we are hypothesizing. We're learning to think. We're looking at a primary source, and we're using our critical thinking ability to come up with our interpretation of it. Okay. Next slide, please. which pie piece has changed its size the most since 1900? Now, if you're teaching a secondary history class, you know, and you're getting into the progressive era about now, and you're saying, has government changed since Teddy Roosevelt? And how about that other Roosevelt? Did he change the size of government? And what about that Great Society? But then there was the Reagan Revolution. Darn, where are we today? Which pie piece has changed the most? Has the courts gotten bigger since 1900 in their power? Has the legislature shrunk as powers maybe have been taken on and responsibilities taken on by different parts of the executive branch, you know, through agencies? And then finally, what pie chart division would best represent the balance of power in the federal government today? Are the three branches equal? Is one branch dominant over the others? And, you know, you can argue that a lot of different ways, but the important thing is to argue it. So what we want to do, basically, through the activity that we've just walked through, is give students an occasion to take ownership of the Constitution. We're going to leave this stage and they're going to take ownership of the country. And so what we want to prepare them to do is to be informed about this Charter of Liberty so that they can fulfill its promise. And so starting when they're in school and getting them to wrestle with the Constitution is critically important. And we felt that this lesson gives you an efficient way to get beyond the language and get to substantive questions about the design for government that you can do, you know, with students from 7th grade through high school. Because, you know, the high school kids, you could just ask them questions that are a little more sophisticated, a little more open-ended, but they can all learn to think by wrestling with some of these slides. Okay, Katie, what's the next slide? Okay, now we're going to talk about Docs Teach. So I'll turn it over to you. We've lost you. You're on
there
mute.
We go. Absolutely. Okay. Thanks, Charlie. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly take a moment just to drop the link to the lesson that Charlie just shared with you all in the chat so everyone has it. And then I'm also going to drop another link for a Docs Teach activity that I'm going to ask you all to take a closer look at with me. So this is going to be a link to the student page of an activity that we are going to dive in together here in just a moment. So let me just fire up the main link here, and then we're going to share some additional resources that you can use to explore the Constitution with your students. So we've seen how you can map the document and take this, find this outline approach, and now we're going to share some resources you can use to dive into the different powers, the different examples, unpack the preamble a bit, all sorts of good stuff. So if you're new to Docs Teach, it is the online tool for teaching with documents from the National Archives. On Docs Teach, you can find primary sources, you can find teaching activities created by the National Archives staff to dive into primary sources, to compare and contrast primary sources, to make connections between primary sources. There's a wealth of different activities to dive into and to share with your students. But the one I want to spotlight right now highlights the preamble of the Constitution. So this is the student page of the activity. So this is one you would share with your students. And what you're going to see is this activity asks you to take a look at two different versions of the preamble. The first is George Washington's copy of a draft of the United States Constitution. And the final is the version we saw earlier, that final version of the Constitution. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment and take a look at the two preambles and see if you can spot any differences between the opening of the draft version and the final version. And just so you know, for your students, if you go to view entire document, if that cursive is challenging as it can be, if you click on view entire document, you will find a transcript available, and you can find a text version of the preamble there. We also have a version of this activity for elementary school students that includes a text version of the final version of the preamble. But for now, in that link that I shared with you, take a moment, take a look at the two preambles, and if you wouldn't mind sending in the chat your responses to what is the difference between these two versions. All right, I'll give you another moment to take a look at these two versions. Yeah, we've got a listing of individual states in the draft version of the Constitution. So we, the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, etc. And then, of course, in the final version, we see the we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, domestic tranquility, and all that good stuff. So there's a significant difference here that you've identified. We can also see, yes, there are some, this draft version, students will usually notice what looks like an F. It's actually a long S that was commonly used in printed and handwritten materials at this time period. So that's another kind of fun historical change to point out for students. And then as we think about, okay, what does the presence of these individual states listed in the draft version versus the change to we, the people of the United States, what's the significance of this changing of the wording? And how might this change reflect the thinking of the founders during the Constitutional Convention? So we can start to really think about this preamble that we memorize, that we recite, but what this was a choice to make these words, we the people of the United States, as we can see going from this draft version to the final version. Feel free, if you've got any thoughts on what that significance may be, feel free to share it in the chat. I'm going to switch back over to our presentation to dive into a few other resources for the Constitution. Okay, so I see in the chat, we cover states, people as we grow in the United States. Absolutely, as we know, the United States expanded beyond those first 13 states. We also notice the handwritten version states a clear purpose for the document. Yeah, it really becomes a purpose statement for the Constitution, why we're establishing it in the first place. Emphasizes that idea of we the people of the United States. Yeah, these are great observations, and hopefully things your students will start to see and think about. And then, of course, you can use that we the people to think about what it means in the context of the changing United States, and amending the Constitution to expand who is included in that we the people. So that's one activity on DocsTeach. I'm going to share a place where you can find some additional resources for teaching the Constitution. But now I want to spotlight another approach we like to take at the National Archives. And as Charlie outlined, we saw, right, we have these different articles that outline the roles and responsibilities of government, but we can actually use primary sources in the holdings of the federal government to take a closer look at what those ideas mean in real life and how do they connect to our lives and our communities today. So for example, if we take a photograph like this one here, we can start with some photo analysis. What do we see? What details stand out to us? What more can we find? What do we think is happening in this photo? And then we can ask students to think, okay, how might this photo connect to the Constitution? Well, pulling out an excerpt from the text, we can look at Article 1, Section 8. Congress shall have the power to establish post offices and post roads. And then from there, we can think about, okay, why does this power impact of Congress impact our lives today? We can think about the needs of communication for connecting these different states, for establishing communications across the country, and how that can have an impact on our communities today, the existence of this postal system. Another example, I'll give you all a moment to take a look at these two primary sources. If you have any ideas or observations of what we might be looking at here, feel free to drop them in the chat. And we've got some document analysis worksheets from the National Archives that help your students break it down into pieces, thinking about who made it, what's the date, where is it from, what is it showing us, what is it talking about, and we can share the links to those document analysis worksheets as well. That can be like a great place to start when you're first meeting the document or taking it back to the Constitution. Yeah, we're looking at some patents here. Absolutely. So, okay, we've got a patent for a game board that many students may remark looks like Monopoly today. We've also got a baseball on the other side. So what do patents, inventions, games have to do with the Constitution? Well, if we pull out another portion of the Constitution, we can see Congress has the power to promote the progress in science, of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Breaking that down, that exclusive right to their writings and discoveries, that is this patent system, this federal patent system. And so you can have students think about, all right, well, why does that matter to my life today? Thinking about, the inventions in their own classroom, home that we may have patents on file for, thinking about why you might get a patent in their first place, how that might be an option for them if they decide to go into the sciences or the arts to protect their work and benefit from it. And why might offering this ability to secure for a limited time your rights to your respective writings and discoveries, why that might encourage you to go into sciences and the arts in the first place. So we can take these kind of fun primary sources. We've got, again, at the National Archives, billions of records. So you can find photographs for younger students, for those just starting to work with primary sources, to more textual documents. But there are so many connections you can make and back to the Constitution to help bring these powers of the government to life. And I'm just going to have us take a look at one last document together. And I want you to think about for a moment, okay, how might we be able to connect this document back to the Constitution? So there's a couple of constitutional connections we can make with this one. I like this record too, and you can find many examples in the archives of students' voices. This can be another fun way to have students think about participating, using their voices. We have this letter from 8-year-old Cheryl Byland in the National Archives because she wrote to President Eisenhower. So in addition to thinking about connecting it back to a specific article, we can also look at this as an example of that First Amendment right to petition the government. And while, Cheryl's idea for a flag wasn't actually adopted, she still used her voice. She had an idea and she shared her thoughts with the president. And we still have that today. So in addition to the First Amendment, though, we can also take this one back to Article 4, Section 3, this idea that new states may be admitted into the Union. The reason why Cheryl's coming up with a new flag idea is what's happening here. There's a 49th state, Alaska, being added to the United States, and that process ties back to the Constitution. So these are just a couple of ideas of how you can use primary sources to unpack the different roles and responsibilities of the three branches of government, the big ideas from the different articles, in a way that helps make the Constitution more relatable and connects to students' lives. And then I'm going to share another link in the chat with you all that is kind of like a one-stop shop for Constitution resources. So on Docs Teach, we have what's called a popular topics page, which is basically like a curated collection of primary sources and teaching activities all about the Constitution. So we've got many popular topics pages, which if you are new to Docs Teach, this can be a great place to dive into this resource. I'm going to highlight the Constitution page here and just show, as you scroll down on the left side, you'll see primary sources for constitutional topics. So if you're looking for sources on teaching checks and balances, you can click on this link and find, okay, we've got an attempted override of President Nixon's veto. We've got documents related to Marbury versus Madison. We've got political cartoons. We've got the Virginia Plan. There's a lot of documents that we can use to explore this idea of checks and balances. And then on the right side, we have activities for teaching about the Constitution. And the Constitution at Work really takes what we just saw, matching primary source documents to different articles and sections of the Constitution, and creates a matching activity that students can use to make these connections. So I encourage you to check out these sources. We've got things for we've got activities for elementary school, middle school, high school. It can be a great place to find some new resources for teaching the Constitution. And the last thing, and let me just go back to my main presentation here to highlight a couple more resources before we open it up to questions, is in addition to these online resources, we also have live interactive programs that explore the Constitution and the Bill of Rights for grades K through 12. So you can request a program for up to 10 students, starting at 10 students and above. You can request multiple programs for multiple classes. We'll work with you to connect you to a National Archives educator located at one of our locations across the country, including the presidential libraries, to do an interactive session that uses primary sources to explore the big ideas of these founding documents and engage students in primary source analysis and discussion to help connect with these new civics knowledge and skills. Additionally, we offer our programs as interactive webinars on a regularly scheduled basis. We've got 2 programs coming up on April 29th and May 20th, and we'll put the link in the chat for where you can go to either request a program or sign up for one of our webinar programs. And then additionally, we have some professional development opportunities coming up, which I'm gonna let Charlie share a little bit more on.
Oh, thanks, Katie. I'm very excited about these, and these are new, and we're gonna have 4 programs for teachers this summer. Now, unfortunately, these ones will be virtual, but we hope COVID will be in the past very soon, and we'll get to do this kind of thing in person. But we'd love to have you join us this summer. And as you can see, on July 19th, from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. It'll be a 2-hour program on teaching the Bill of Rights for elementary educators. And so this will be lots of ideas for teaching in active learning, kind of hands-on ways with younger students about the Bill of Rights. And then on July 21st, again, 12:30 to 2:30 p.m., we'll have a 2-hour program on teaching about the Bill of Rights for secondary educators. We're really into active learning, and we're really into giving you resources that you can take back to your classroom to get students talking to each other about these charters. Now, the Constitution will be the topic of the 3rd program, July 26th, again, same time, 12:30 to 2:30. And that's going to be We the People, and it's teaching the Constitution for elementary educators. We've talked about the Constitution tonight for largely middle school and high school, but we also have a lot of resources for younger students, things that, are really attractive to younger learners, like that flag letter. Kids really like stuff from other kids. And so we're going to have a program here full of ideas about how to teach the Constitution to younger students. And then the 4th program is going to be about a very important topic for our time, and that's the power to vote. And it's going to be on July 28th from 12:30 to 2:30. And that's going to be the Power to Vote, Who Decides? And it's going to, again, be a workshop for secondary educators to give you lots of resources on teaching about that fundamental power of our civic life. So I hope you'll see one of these programs that appeals to you. And the link at the bottom of this screen, which will also be on materials Katie will share with you, will take you to an online page where you can register. And it's free, and we'd love to have you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. We'll pause now to see if you have any questions for us. I'm also going to go ahead and drop in an email address where if you'd like a PDF with all the links from today's program, feel free to shoot me an email and we'll get that to you right away. For the summer PD sessions, we will be able to provide a certificate of participation that you can share with your organizations to show that you did participate. Feel free, if you have any other questions, you can drop them in the chat. And I'll add some final links, the civics@nara.gov email address. If you'd like to receive any of these resources, I'll also drop in that page where you can find links to the professional development registration and how you can request student programs or join us for some of our upcoming webinars. I'll drop that in the chat as well.
We really value the work that you do. And so I hope that you see our event this evening as the start of a conversation. And I hope you'll feel invited and welcome to reach out to us by email with any sort of questions you have. We would love to have a conversation with you about teaching. We know that you're shaping the future through the work you do in your classroom, and we really admire the work you do.